DARPA does many great things. It, of course, created the internet, originally called the ARPANET. Because of DARPA, we have GPS technology, sensor technology. But DARPA's mandate, as was instructed to Congress when DARPA was created in 1958, is to create vast weapon systems of the future. That's the quote. And when I found that quote, I thought, I must always keep that in mind when I'm researching and reporting on DARPA, because that is its job. So everything is about military technology. Everything that it works on is how does this support national security? And that is, of course, a double-edged sword, because that which keeps you safe can also harm you.
So with that in mind, let's start at the origins of DARPA. There's really two watershed moments that give rise to DARPA. One is the detonation of the 15 megaton H-bomb, as well as the Sputnik launch, and really the off-the-mark estimation by the U.S. of Soviet aggression and capabilities. Talk to us a little bit more about how DARPA was created and what its original mission was.
Well, I begin the book with this extraordinary explosion, 15 megaton. It was called Castle Bravo bomb. I interviewed two scientists who worked on that bomb, who were there, that were witness to that test. And I think from hearing their eyewitness testimony about this explosion, you get the real sense right away of, like, these are big weapons. And DARPA was created to defend against the weapon which we had created, American scientists. So it begins with this idea of the military-industrial complex existing and having a built-in obsolescence, that the weapon we created will pretty soon be obsolete and a new weapon system will have to be created. But the real moment that DARPA began was several years later when the Soviets launched Sputnik. And so Sputnik was just a little 23-inch sphere. And we might say, looking back at history, well, what's so threatening about that? But the Soviets had beaten us into space. And not only that, Sputnik was lofted by an ICBM, and the idea was, well, if the Soviets can get Sputnik into space, they can also get a nuclear warhead into space and down onto Washington, D.C. real soon. And so DARPA was created literally in a matter of weeks after the launch of Sputnik to make sure that we, America, were never again taken by technological surprise. And what's interesting, in all these decades since, DARPA has done its job, in essence, because we've never been taken by technological surprise. DARPA has also done its job to create this very powerful, almost omnipotent military-industrial complex that is forever creating new weapon systems once the weapon systems become public and the enemy creates that same weapon system.
And so, I mean, that's really a part of an irony of the creation of DARPA and the Eisenhower administration when it was created. And coming out of that administration, his warning to the American public about being concerned about the rise of and the eventual omnipotence of that military-industrial complex. And so just to take us to today really quick, in terms of DARPA and its influence and its mission, but really ultimately, who is making these decisions about our future and our destiny? I mean, in terms of that military-industrial complex.
Well, that was a very interesting part of researching the book, to learn that one of the, DARPA is very quickly into the game realized that there were these major national security problems that needed solving. And so they looked to what DARPA called the supermen of science. And these were the Jacobsen scientists. And anyone here, this doesn't look like much of a conspiracy theory crowd, but anyone who follows conspiracy theories probably knows that the Jacobsen scientists are often considered right up there with the Illuminati in terms of, people see them as these wizards behind the curtain doing all these kind of bad things. When in fact, I interviewed the co-founder of the Jacobsen scientists, a physicist named Marvin Goldberger. And he created the Jacobsens with a couple fellow physicist colleagues in 1960 and advised the Pentagon for decades. And what I found was that the Jacobsen scientists were remarkably level-headed and detached in their assessments. They wrote a number of reports, many of which Goldberger shared with me, declassified reports. Many still are classified. But what was interesting is to get the perspective of Goldberger that went like this, which is that the Jason scientists were all physicists who were academics, so they taught most of the time at America's great universities. And then in the summer, they would gather for what they called summer studies, and they would address these great problems of national defense. And you see over the decades the Jasons advising the DARPA this way, and I write about their role in all the different wars, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War. But when you come full circle to where we are now, I learned a very important thing. And it has to do with the fact that the Pentagon is really moving toward autonomous weapons. And people surprisingly aren't really familiar with this. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, wow, what if? When in fact, this is dogma at the Pentagon. And you can read about it in their unclassified reports that talk about DARPA's plans and the Pentagon's plans for drones and autonomous warfare, also called hunter-killer drones, through 2038. And when I was having a discussion with one of the program managers at DARPA about some of these hunter-killer drones, the science of which is being pursued in these very sort of spooky areas that involve brain implants and mapping the brain and charting, neurological behavior in brain-wounded warriors. And I was saying, well, I read a report where the Jason scientists do not think this is a good idea. In fact, they specifically advise the Pentagon against moving in this direction. And the program manager, Michael Goldblatt, said to me, well, Jason's hardly relevant anymore. And I said, what do you mean? This is news to me. And he said, well, it's kind of news at the Pentagon, and it just started happening during the War on Terror, where the Jason scientists are being moved out. And in their place of power has come a group called the Defense Science Board, who has been at the Pentagon for a while, but their position in terms of advising the Pentagon and advising how DARPA will move forward has changed. And here's the rub that concerned me, is that the Defense Science Board is made up of individuals who are full-time defense contractors. They are not part-time defense contractors and full-time academics. They sit on the boards of these major, whether it's Boeing, Lockheed, General Dynamics, etc. And they are the ones who are now really advising DARPA how the government should move toward autonomous warfare, which brings up a very important question. And it brings up what you asked about, which was Eisenhower's concept of the military-industrial complex. So if those who are advising the Pentagon how to proceed and which vast weapon systems of the future to create are the very individuals who are responsible for creating and selling those vast weapon systems of the future, then you have that closed loop that Eisenhower warned against.
Because over the history of DARPA and with the involvement of the Jason scientists, there has been time and again where they have given warning, saying this is not an appropriate use of, say, this technology, whether that was utilizing nuclear warfare on the Ho Chi Minh Trail during Vietnam and perhaps other examples. And with that, it's almost a conscience, and it seems as if there has been this tension, or there is still some tension within the Pentagon, but beyond that, there is the greater need for an informed citizenry. Can you describe a little bit of that tension? Is that tension, is it getting greater, or are we seeing the scales tip in one way or the other?
Well, the tension is really arising from this idea that what the Pentagon believes the best way forward in warfare is, and again, these are unclassified documents. I write about them in the book. I mean, they're available to be read. Some of them are quite long. But it talks about how the Pentagon is moving toward robotic warfare. These are weapons that people know as hunter-killer drones. So whereas now you have a drone that's under remote control, there's an operator somewhere, whether it's Creech Air Force Base or in Washington, D.C., flying this drone over the war theater, there is a movement that will go toward drones that are self-governing, and that you can essentially, let's say, and this is a bad version, but you show the drone a photograph and say, go assassinate this guy and report back to me. That's an autonomous drone. The intelligence, the capabilities are not there yet, but the Pentagon is very insistent on the pursuit of these technologies. And so you ask about the pushback. Well, I was surprised to learn that much of the pushback is actually coming from inside the Pentagon. So the Pentagon, gave out sort of questionnaires to many people, from the commanding officers to the drone operators, asking what the general feel was about this movement toward autonomous drones. And the general consensus was not a good idea. So instead of taking that into consideration and maybe shifting policy, then Undersecretary of Defense Ashton Carter, who's now the Secretary of Defense, sent out this memo which said, let's create a program where we work on robotics and ethics. And so then that was disseminated among the commanding generals, the drone operators, and everybody in between, to sort of learn that robots could have ethics. And the idea came back, well, no, not at all, because robots don't have morals. And then this is where it got really tricky. So that trail kind of stops, and I was unable to find out what happened next, what the next movement was from the Pentagon. But separately, I noticed that right around this time, DARPA started a new program, and it has to do with trust. And it's called Narrative Networks. It's one of those really innocuous names, the N2 program. And on face value, it's like DARPA's working with storytellers and anthropologists to try to figure out how people, are influenced by narratives. But another element of the Narrative Networks program works very specifically, and I interviewed the scientist on this program, deals with a chemical in the brain called oxytocin. And that is sometimes called the brain's moral molecule. And it is this idea that this is what humans use as a trust mechanism in their brain. So if you trust someone, you emit oxytocin. A breastfeeding mother, for example, this is in DARPA documentation, emits oxytocin. And so DARPA is now having this program looking into the use of oxytocin and how you can manipulate trust. And again, this is speculation, but one can't help but wonder, okay, the guys at the Pentagon don't like the idea toward movement toward autonomous drones. They don't trust drones that have self-government, and let's have a program that manipulates trust. And that's where we get into some of those ideas about, well, what is DARPA really doing? What are their goals, and how are they achieving them?
I mean, it's interesting to see, again, from the evolution of DARPA and its original focus, looking at deterring or at least being able to defeat a nuclear attack, and something that is on a global and a large scale. And over the years, how that has come down, it's really kind of been filtered down and focused down more and more, almost on the individual. And the idea of weapon systems going all the way down into a single warfighter. And how do you augment cognition? How do you make that person who is injured in warfare continue to fight? How do you deal with fatigue? It's beyond just the larger weapon system. It takes us into the evolution, in some ways, of humans.
DARPA calls it transhumanism, military transhumanism. But in an interesting way, this is actually part and parcel of the whole movement towards robotics. It's not only making individual warfighters comfortable with robots, it's this idea of coupling man and machine and merging humans and machine. And DARPA is doing that with programs now with what they call biohybrids, which people might call cyborgs. They are able to actually control a rat through a labyrinth remotely because they've implanted electrodes in its brain. They can do the same with a moth. DARPA in 2014 created a steerable moth by inserting electrodes in the pupa stage of the moth, which then transformed. The wings came out, and this part of the machinery is now part of the animal system. DARPA is able to steer a moth. And when you ask about transhumanism, and as I write in the book, it all began in this very interesting moment decades ago. This is actually not new. It was when the Berlin Wall came down. Many Soviet bioweapons engineers defected to the United States, and DARPA hired them a quote from a DARPA director at the time was, "We had no biologists in the Pentagon. They were busy having those people like the Jason scientists, supermen of scientists, men dealing with machines, engineers, physicists looking at these big space systems." But suddenly, the idea that biology is important became what was called a thrust at DARPA. And there began this movement to look inside the body, to work with what they call the dismounted soldier, the guy that's walking on the ground. And this led to a whole new umbrella of programs, which is called augmented cognition, which is called, in short, the super soldier program. And it's how to make warfighters smarter than other warfighters, stronger than other warfighters. And again, these, are double-edged swords. Many people who are proponents of transhumanism say, why not control evolution? The cochlear implant, the pacemaker being great examples of, benefiting man by augmenting the physical body. People who are very against transhumanism say, there's something really wrong with this. I think the reason that I like writing narrative stories, as I do in my book, is that I tell it from the perspective of the people involved, and maybe you get to decide what you think of transhumanism.
So there are other elements that DARPA has very much been on the forefront of. And so it is getting down to, in some cases, how are we changing or how can we change humans? But then it's also mapping humans, and whether that is with the global war on terror and the evolution of kind of the scientists involved and more of a social science approach to fighting terrorism, to also literally humans becoming data points. And some of the programs born out of DARPA's own visions. Can you talk a little bit about that? And one of the programs, Total Information Awareness, and how that's evolved to what has become a lot of news in recent years.
So here we're in the realm of what DARPA, the Pentagon, calls ISR. It's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And it's an idea that actually goes back to the Vietnam War, when DARPA had its first shift, going from these big sort of anti-ballistic missile defense programs to suddenly being sent into the jungles of Vietnam and being asked to create different weapon systems to fight the insurgents, particularly on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this idea sprang forth of sensor technology. And at the time, it was so rudimentary. It was like guys, and I interview these guys in the book, that are flying in low and slow over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Incredibly dangerous. In one situation, these guys are shot down, and they're rescued in this very dramatic way. Because what they were doing is they're dropping out of the aircraft and helicopters these giant sensors that are like this big. They're kind of shaped like a dart, and they're supposed to literally fly out of the aircraft, land on the ground in a string, and then the electronic information gets relayed up to a helicopter that's flying in a racetrack formation overhead. And then that information gets relayed back to what was called an information center in Thailand, where soldiers are using these new technologies, this is back in 1965, 66, called computers, to try and create algorithms to figure out what these Ho Chi Minh fighters are doing on the trail, where they're headed, what they're going to attack next. I mean, this technology was laughed at the Pentagon, by the way. But of course, this is now exactly what we know as surveillance, as the big surveillance network that you referred to. And we saw this program again in the war on terror, when DARPA ran into a lot of trouble publicly when it created a system called the Total Information Awareness program. And that was this idea to use sensor technology to monitor American citizens, to look at their credit card transactions, to look at the library books they take out, to monitor who they're talking to try and create, with computers which are now very sophisticated, and algorithms which have gotten much more sophisticated with help from NSA, etc., to then use this system of systems to find not the Ho Chi Minh fighter on the trail, but rather the terrorist among us. And so you can see how one technology decades later becomes this other incredible DARPA technology. And that is very much what we have now in the surveillance systems that are going on.
So over the course of DARPA's history, there has been, with some of its inventions, with some of its programs, there has been pushback. One was this total information awareness that eventually got splintered off into the NSA and PRISM and a variety of other programs. Can you recount some of the other experiences or the other incidents in the past that DARPA has really had to, has had to either sweep under the carpet or in some ways fix its public image?
Its image, yes. I mean, after the Vietnam War, an interesting thing happened. There's this perception that there was it wasn't a perception, it was a reality that there was a downsizing of the military per se, which there was. DARPA got in big trouble for doing what was called pre-requirement research, for creating weapon systems that were ahead of the time when in fact we needed to be fighting this war in Vietnam that we lost. And so DARPA was punished. It got kicked out of the Pentagon, that sort of coveted place to be, and sent several miles away, where it is now in Arlington, Virginia. They had a couple moves. But so DARPA kind of got its wrist slapped, and there was a moment with many of the people who were there at the time talking about how, they thought maybe the agency would be folded, but that's not what happened. In fact, the opposite happened, which is that suddenly DARPA got an influx of money thanks to the Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, who was the first scientist in the Pentagon to be Secretary of Defense. Brown had been in charge of all the DARPA technology during the Vietnam War, specifically the sensor technology. And Brown created an entire industry behind this idea of information technology, behind the idea of nanotechnology, which is the art of making things small, that all of these sensor systems could be shrunken down. And so even though the public perception was that DARPA was in trouble, DARPA had created Agent Orange during the war. So there was a real idea of banishment, and yet, in fact, the agency flourished. And it didn't really become evident until the Gulf War, when we had a Secretary of Defense, then Dick Cheney, who was a real proponent of using technology to win. And the Gulf War was that incredible show of power, network-centric warfare that displayed what DARPA was capable of and what you could do to an enemy force if you had technological superiority. But that only worked in that very specific environment, and it certainly didn't work the next war on the horizon, the war on terror, which dealt with urban warfare.
So with these directions that DARPA has taken, and some there's been trajectories over decades. Again, going back to another example out of the Vietnam War was the idea of trying to apply behavioral science or some social science to understand, or seemingly to try to understand the Viet Cong and what was motivating, what was driving them. But in some cases, it's taken the Pentagon years to appreciate what DARPA has concluded or what they suggested. What happened in that case with the Viet Cong?
Well, I was really surprised, like you're referring to learn that there were anthropologists hired by DARPA in the war, and that came, and again, there's a parallel here with the Iraq War, so I think it's very interesting to consider, because the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at the time, was stuck on this question. He actually had the equivalent, the 1960s version of a Post-it note in his office that said, "What made the Vietnam tick?" He wanted to know why these Viet Cong fighters were siding with the communists and not siding with the Americans. And so DARPA set about this sprawling program where it hired anthropologists and social scientists to go into the field, to conduct interviews, to try and find out what made the Viet Cong tick. And I write at length, and I interviewed the lead on that, a man named Joseph Zasloff. And part of why he felt what he told me was so important, because this was a colossal failure. I mean, the Hearts and Minds campaign failed. And Zasloff said that he felt that, when he saw this same thing going on in the Iraq War, because, again, DARPA got this idea, almost like it had amnesia, that DARPA had done this during the Vietnam War, got this brilliant idea during the war on terror. Hey, let's start a Hearts and Minds campaign and figure out what makes the Iraqis tick. And it was the same story over again, and that same failure. So the idea is DARPA is investing all this time and treasure, and one would hope that one would at least get experience and be able to say, well, this doesn't work, how do we need to adjust? And instead, it's astonishing to see that same, instead of experience, you get amnesia. And it was no louder spoken to me when I read the Army issued a statement when it kicked this program into effect in Iraq. It was called the Human Terrain Program. And on their website, the Army wrote, "This is the first time in history that anthropologists and social scientists are being sent into the war theater on a large scale." But no, it wasn't.
With the shift in influence, and it's interesting talking about trying to find the trust molecule, with the evolution of the influence of DARPA and who is influencing DARPA, is this an agency that the American public can trust? On one hand, we've gotten this narrative from DARPA again and again about what it has essentially given the world. Again, the example of the internet or GPS to make sure that we're not getting lost on our way to tonight's talk. Is with those beneficial those benefits aside, is this an agency you feel like that we can trust?
The journalist's job is to inform the public. So I try to tell the story straight down and let people conclude. But I'm also mindful of the fact that Eisenhower warned the public against the military-industrial complex and also said that the way to balance that out was the alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And that's why I think it's important, your question which asks about influence. As a whole, I found that all of these scientists that work for DARPA are really amazing scientists working super hard on pushing technology and science in a way, and grateful that DARPA is there to fund them. I found that the problem, and this is my opinion and not my presentation as much, but I found that the problem seemed to lie in that idea of influence. And that's where my own position as a citizen kicks in as opposed to a journalist, which is, that Eisenhower did warn against this idea of unwarranted influence. And it seems that, when he spoke those words in 1961, the military-industrial complex, the defense contractors, were just getting started. And now, of course, they are omnipotent. And I think that the alert and knowledgeable citizenry has a responsibility to pay attention to this. People always say, well, isn't Congress doing anything about this? No, they're not. But, you can just simply by being aware, by knowing that the people that are advising the Pentagon which weapon systems to procure are the people who are creating them.
Because there's certain elements that you cover in your book where there's ideas of how to treat the injured warfighter, whether it is with elements of brain injury, traumatic brain injury, to even limb regeneration, which again seems to be going away from the idea of creating new weapon systems.
Quite the opposite.
But so what's really happening there?
Well, the limb regeneration lab, that's super interesting. It's this idea that humans can one day, regenerate their own limbs. And when I was interviewing the scientists down at UC Irvine who are working on this program, and I said, because what I try to do is make science simple, really make it understandable. And I said, but just help me out, make it really simple. Salamanders can regenerate their limbs, humans can't. How does that work? And Dr. Gardner said to me, well, actually, humans can regenerate. We all did. And I kind of looked at him and he said, we all began as one cell, and then we were two, and then we were more. That's regeneration. So we have the capacity to regenerate. And when you look at big science in that way, that these guys are taking big science and going small, that's big. Those are big ideas. DARPA's funding that. Is that a weapon system? No. That is, helping warfighters who lose limbs or individuals who lose limbs in accidents. But the brain programs are very different because my understanding from interviewing DARPA scientists, the brain programs are presented by DARPA, and many of them are very classified. They're in the clinical trial stage. It's this idea of implanting neural prosthetics into the brain of brain wounded warriors, so guys who come back from Iraq and Afghanistan with brain injuries, who have cognitive impairment. And this idea that these neural implants will help restore their brain functions. And so that is a noble idea, and DARPA has teamed up with the White House on the Brain Initiative to do this. But what many scientists said to me is there is also something else going on, which is DARPA mapping the brain and DARPA using this information from the electrodes in the brain to learn about how the neural networks work, so that, and this is the idea, that long coveted barrier to break artificial intelligence can happen, because DARPA has been at the forefront of artificial intelligence since its inception, and no one has been able to figure out how to make machines think. And the idea is that these brain chip programs are actually will lead the way toward true artificial intelligence, which syncs right up in line with the idea of self-governance in autonomous weapons.
So on one hand, sitting here in the San Francisco Bay Area in the United States, it's, I don't know if exactly comforting, but the idea that we do have some of the best and brightest working on these problems, these questions. How does DARPA then compare to, and for our benefit or for the national security, how does that compare with what other countries are doing? What do you have a sense of the level of competition and kind of where DARPA is in making sure that we are not caught surprised?
I mean, Russia recently said we have a better DARPA than DARPA. So you can see the competition. However, on balance, no one has ever been able to take the United States by military surprise. And a lot of DARPA scientists ask me, look, before you, point out the bad in DARPA, don't forget to mention the good, which is that, and a couple different scientists would present this scenario. Imagine, if Russia or China or a dark horse like Saudi Arabia were to suddenly announce that they had created the first human clone, which many people are researching, or broken this barrier of artificial intelligence and produced an autonomous weapon. How would you feel as an American then? And wouldn't you say DARPA has failed? So DARPA has done its job. It's just that one must also